Hello everybody, thank you very much for coming to the Bastiat Society of Raleigh event for April 12, 2023. We are pleased to have Professor Richard Salsman, who's Professor of Political Economy at Duke University, and he's going to talk about the debt crisis. Gosh, maybe when it gets to $31 trillion, you should talk about it. I was really pleased to be able to read Richard's book, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? And I can tell you, it's the not clean version of the two books up here, because I read it. I actually read it. It's a thick book. It took me 9 months. Well, I'm just joking. It took me 7. And I annotate it and everything, and it's brilliant. It's got some great insights. I really recommend it. You will definitely come away learning a lot more about the economy, where things have gone right and where things have gone wrong. In any case, I'm going to introduce Professor Michael Munger of Duke University, who will then introduce more about Professor Salsman. Thank you.
Thanks for this opportunity to do this introduction of my friend and Duke colleague, Richard Salsman. Richard graduated from Bowdoin College in 1981. He graduated with an MBA from New York University in 1988. And to my great pride, he graduated with a political science degree in 2012 at Duke University. He has been a research professor at Duke now for much of the past decade. His experience was working in banking, in fixed income securities, and which basically means he's a pirate. Those of you who work in fixed income, that means he's a pirate. I am reminded when I think of Richard, though, and the eloquence that he has of Shakespeare's description of Henry V. So Canterbury, describing Henry V, said, "Turn him to any cause of policy, and he unloosens it as familiar as his garter. Let him speak, and the air, a chartered libertine, is still." Now, Richard is not a chartered libertine, but he is a chartered financial analyst. So with that, let me present to you my good friend, Richard Salsman.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Munger. Thank you all for coming. This is, I think, a hot topic, but it makes people's eyes glaze over at the same time. National debt. But there's drama in debt. There are things like defaults and empires falling because they can't pay their debts, or inflating the money supply because they can't pay their debts. So, and there's a debate going on in Washington, right, about a debt ceiling. I'm not even going to talk about that, but if you want to ask about it, you can. So I thought I would present my views and some data in friendly form. There'll be graphs, not too many numbers, I hope, to explain to you what this is and why it matters, why it's important, and what some of the deeper causes might be. Now, has anyone ever seen this before? You can go online, some of you are saying yes, and hit something called it's literally usdebtclock.org, and you get all this information. And as far as I'm concerned, that's all the information you need, and my job is done. So good night. I'll see you. I'll see you at the bar. Oh, you can't figure what all this means? By the way, that's only half the page. I had to stop it at some point. There is stuff below there. Actually, I'm talking about that part. Upper left, Someone figured out that that's the most important number. All the other numbers relate to other measures of debt at various levels, but then also the economy and blah, blah, blah. But that's too much, isn't it? It's a bit too much. If you click on it, by the way, all the numbers are moving. So you'll also faint maybe if you watch this in real time. I think there's a debt clock still in Times Square as well. Well, here's what I'm going to try to cover, some of them more extensively, but some of them superficially. What is public economics and public finance, which is where this comes from? What is fiscal capacity? Sounds like a technical academic term, but it's actually kind of a cool concept. My main focus will be on public debt. What does it mean? What causes it? What are the effects? Then I'll talk about forms of default, because if you borrow too much, well, even on a personal level, you can default. What does that even mean? Is that okay? Some of us just go into bankruptcy court, reorganize our debts. That seems okay. That's actually even allowed in the US Constitution. So what happens when governments do that? The golden rule of public finance, which I've written about, that is a very cool thing you'll see. The subtitle of my talk is the welfare warfare state. So I'm going to make an argument that both aspects of state action are very relevant to running up public debts. And the question is why? Why those two things? These are more technical. Number 7, exorbitant privilege and reserve currency. Those I put in quotes because they're phrases, but I have whole chapters on them in my book. I'll end with the deficit, what I call the deficit of democracy. Now, I know some of you out there, if this is pitched too high and over your heads, you're not going to enjoy that at all. But some of you are technicians and are in the business and know this stuff really well, so you might be bored from another reason. So I have no other way but to pitch it somewhat in the middle and my job is to simplify, not complexify. I was always taught in grad school, Salsman, you need to complexify. Make it more difficult and nuanced than you're doing. I'm going to go the opposite today because it's a general audience. Here's my theme. A perpetually expanding national debt is partly an economic phenomenon, but ultimately it's a mere symptom. It's a symptom, I'm going to argue, of a deeper political, ethical causes. Now there's more to it than that. The deeper political cause is democratic excess. What does that mean? Majorities outvoting minorities in demanding levels of government spending which they are unwilling to be fully taxed for. Let that settle in for a moment. People voting for programs, spending programs, but I don't really want to pay for that. Don't tell me at the same time I'm going to get this program that I'm going to pay for it by taxes. Either somebody else should pay for it, or none of us should pay for it, or some flim-flam thing. You get the idea. I'll elaborate on this. And then finally, though, at a still deeper level, see, I'm going from economics, politics, ethics. What's it got to do with ethics? At a still deeper level, I think the problem is an improper, now get this now, ultimately inhumane ethic. What kind of ethic? It's kind of parasitical. A majority wants something for nothing. Put it another way, increasingly a nation of freeloaders and free riders, we call them in economics. In George Leaf's words, takers outnumbering makers. What's that all about? George talked about that last month. Excellent. Politicians as mere brokers between Peter and Paul. You know who Peter and Paul are. We rob Peter to pay Paul. Those of you who want Peter, Paul, and Mary, maybe the politician is Mary. Mary, the politician, is brokering between Peter and Paul. All right, let's get this out of the way. This topic in academia, in economics, just so you know, it's called public economics. It's a fascinating field. It's a subset of economics. Public economics deals with the interaction between government and the economy. There are many, of course. We could talk about regulation. We talk about antitrust law. We talk about taxing. A whole bunch of things, but I'm going to focus on debt. But anyway, that's the broader topic. The extent to which it interacts and why and the results. Public finance is a subset of public economics. It specifically asks, how does government fund itself? That's why finance is in there. So it's not corporate finance. If you study corporate finance, it's how private companies finance themselves. Public finance is how governments finance themselves. And you can see why it would be related to public economics, because if the government is a small part of the economy, if it's only spending like a small little amount, public finance is almost a secondary small thing. Like they don't have much to finance. But imagine they're spending lots of money in forever wars, in social programs that are fundamentally actuarially bankrupt. Now public finance is going to be a huge topic. All right. I wrote a book 5 years ago called, well, it took me longer than, I didn't write it overnight, The Political Economy of Public Debt, 3 centuries of theory and evidence. I collected 300 years of data on government borrowing. It was mostly Britain and America, but 12 different countries also. When did they borrow? How much did they borrow? Why did they borrow? Did they ever default? Why did they default? How did that interact with the central bank? All the things associated with public debt, but it was called the political economy of, because my theory has been that you need to know, obviously, with public anything, you need to have some kind of theory or a view of government's role in the economy to understand the whole thing. So you can't just be a bond analyst. And you can't just be a political scientist who knows nothing about interest rates. It takes a really interesting mix of knowledge and data to be able to get your hands around this. So that's a technical book. By the way, I have to thank Professor Munger. This book came out of the dissertation I wrote when Professor Munger was my chair on the committee. I don't think this book would have been written had he not beaten me into shape, because the first draft of what I was going to do for that dissertation was, would you say undoable? It was undoable.
I said it was undoable.
It's undoable. He said it's either undoable or it's doable in 10 years, and we're not going to put up with you for that long. So get out of here. This is more recent. I have a chapter in this book on the fiscal cliff, and I'll return to this. The chapter is called The Golden Rule of Public Finance and Prospects for Its Revival, which is another way of saying it's kind of dead in the water. So that'll come at the end. I'll explain what that is, what I think about it. It's a very interesting concept. So, and also, I have copies of my book over there that Brad so nicely referenced. So if you want copies afterwards, just let me know. I'll sign some copies for you. But there's a subset of this book totally focused on this topic tonight. So the section 6 is called The Fiscal State and Its Burden. There's about 50 or 60 pages there on the topic. Okay, before I dive into public debt, let me talk about fiscal capacity. This is the capacity of a government to get resources. It's called fiscal capacity, not my phrase. It's in the literature. It's the extent to which a government can extract resources from the economy. I didn't say steal. I could be really nasty libertarian and say this is the way they steal stuff. I'm just going to say extract. We can leave open whether it's done justly or not. But the extraction process, the extent to which, how does it do it? How much can it get? And it interestingly depends on the forms and targets of extraction. So one form would be tax people. Another one would be take their stuff, nationalization, asset forfeiture. But another one might be borrow their stuff. That's what tonight's topic is, borrowing. And the targets of, well, some people won't put up with it. Some people won't participate. Some people will resist. The whole history of public finance has included tax revolts. Very exciting, this country was founded on tax revolts. So public finance has this great history, this great drama. Well, fiscal capacity also depends on culture, that's a broad concept, on trust or not in the government. If you trust the government, you're like, yeah, I'll give you my stuff. If you don't trust the government, you're like, I'm not giving you a dime. And on citizens' capacity and will, this is out of order here, citizens' willingness and capacity, you need both, to accept the extraction. or maybe to avoid it or evade it. So if you want to ask in the Q&A about tax avoidance and tax evasion and other things like that. But that's what fiscal capacity is. It's almost like this game, if you like game theory. It's this game between the extractor and the extracted. And they're trying to get what they can out of you, and if you're aware of what's going on, trying to minimize what they get out of you. Let me give you a very good example of this, a very, I hope, memorable example of fiscal capacity. This is a chart going back quite a ways, 1930. Now, look what this is. This is fascinating. The red line is the top marginal tax rate. You know the phrase, soak the rich. Tax them, tax the rich. They're terrible. So the tax rates, it started when the U.S. income tax started in 1913. Anyone remember what the top rate was? The initial top rate on rich people in 1913. 7%. Just 7, but by World War I, it was up to 77. That didn't take long, 3 or 4 weeks. Well, look at this. The rates are there, 90 in excess of 90% in this period. Now, 90% means every dollar you earn, they take 90. You keep a dime. The incentive effects are very minimal. And then tax rates were cut. There were 3 major cuts: the Kennedy years, these are the Reagan years, and now look, they're down to like 35 or 40. So historically, this again just the top rate on the richest people, richest incomers, is kind of back where it was before. Now in between all this, look at this number. The green number is tax revenues. Notice how steady it is? I mean, it goes up a bit here. But starting here, it's 18 to 20% every year. What does that mean? Why do they only collect 18% of GDP when the rate was 94? And then when the Reaganites got it all the way down to 28, they still only took in 19% of. This is the issue of tax or fiscal capacity. The government's trying to extract resources from the economy, right? And one method would be, hey, soak the rich, raise tax rates. Maybe we'll get, no, we didn't get more. What's that all about? And by the way, what would the incentive effects be here? Very disincentivized. Why would I start a business? I keep 10% of them. When the rates were down to 28, you get to keep 72%, 72 cents out of every dollar. So the incentive effects were enormous. This says something, this gap here between the two. This says something about it goes something like this. We're not gonna pay more than 20% to you, no matter what you do to us. And if you charge 94% tax, guess what we're gonna do? We're gonna go to Washington and lobby for what? Tax loopholes, exemptions, deduction. And we're highly motivated to do it, right? Because if we can get any relief, it'll mean a lot. And guess what? The politicians know this. How about a 94% rate? Might you come knocking at my door? I need a tax break here. When they brought the rates down to this, they got rid of many of the loopholes. So the tax code, the rate was lower and the tax base was not pockmarked with exemptions and deductions. A lot less cronyism going on, a lot less lobbying, because why lobby them? They're not taking as much as your wealth. So that's an issue of tax capacity. Countries will differ on this, but that's the US history at least. Now, here are the 3 basic sources of government financing. And I'm going to focus on borrowing, but I want you to see the broader context. Other than stealing stuff by nationalizing, we assume we don't have a socialist country here where they just nationalize the means of production. These are the 3 methods. They tax you, they borrow from you, but the third one becoming more and more important, and I spoke on this last October, I gave an entire talk here on inflation. The third one is money creation. Now, quickly, why is this electorally risky? Class, this is participation time. I'll tax you. Electorally risky because what? I'm not going to vote for you. You're going to raise my taxes? No. So electorally risky. Tax base erode. Tax base is what is the income that the government is taxing. It erodes if the rates are high, right? You either hide your income, or you put it offshore, or you delay it into future periods. There's escape activity that goes on, if you will, and that erodes what's called the tax base, what the government can take from. And if you know the Laffer curve from supply side economics, there's a prohibitive, what he calls a prohibitive range, where the tax rate becomes so high that the government ends up getting actually less revenue rather than more. Why? Because it so depresses the motivation to earn income and produce things. All right, so those are the problems associated with taxation, which I'm going to say will explain part of why we have an exploding national debt. But let's go to the debt first. Crowding out effects. Because this is the government borrowing money from people. Crowding out means, well, other people could have borrowed. Other companies could have borrowed. Corporations, you, others could have borrowed instead of the government borrowing. But the government going in there and seen as a risk-free borrower, they might potentially crowd you out and get the pool of savings, if you will, or a bigger portion of it than you do because of the government. That's a problem, because if those other sectors are productive, it's going to make the economy less productive. Because the productive sectors aren't able to borrow or at a good enough rate. Interest expense. Interest expense is a budget item for the government. So when it borrows, it also has to pay interest, right? So that becomes a budget item. What if they borrow a lot? Or what if they borrow a lot and the interest rate goes up? We're now approaching, I'm not going to show you the numbers here today, but the interest expense on the federal debt is approaching what's spent on national defense. The entire Pentagon budget, which is $850 billion. Default risk. I'll talk about default more later, but that's an obvious risk. If you borrow too much, you can't pay it back. Default, what does that mean? Because remember, this is an asset held by other people. Banks hold the asset. Insurance companies hold the asset. Mutual funds own the asset. They own the bonds, right? So if there's a default, your asset goes away. Money creation. I'll talk about this more later, but obviously the risks here are inflation and deflation. Inflation is a decline in the purchasing power of your money. Deflation is the opposite, but typically what happens is that there's excess borrowing. The Federal Reserve will monetize the debt. They do this by creating money. They're basically printing money and giving it to the government, which looks like borrowing, but it's really money printing. All right, I'll show you some data on this soon, but let's move on. There's a problem of something called fiscal illusion. Now, if you're at a magic show, what is illusion? Here's the rabbit, here's the hat, here's the, whoa, what happened? I've been tricked and fooled in some way. Which of these three is more or less voluntary? Class, show of hands, anyone? Of the three, which would you say is the most voluntary, say? What? Taxation is voluntary? I think they'll arrest you if you don't pay your taxes. Men with guns will come. Who says, show of hands, who says taxation is the most voluntary? And who says borrowing is the most voluntary? And who says money creation? Oh, that's it. Okay. A big fan of money creation. Which of these is most felt? What does that mean? Most felt by citizens. Ouch! The pinch of ow! Money creation. Remember, it's just money creation. I didn't say inflation. They don't. If you ask someone on the street, how much did the M1 go up last week? How much did it hurt you? I don't know.
They say how much the groceries cost last year.
And they'll blame the grocer.
When I look at my paycheck, I really have taxation.
Most people say taxation, that hurts. Wow, I'm paying the bill here. Hurts less, by the way, if they take it out of your income every withholding, which was started in the 1930s because the tax burden became so great. Milton Friedman said, why don't you just withhold it from their paycheck every week? Milton Friedman came up with that idea. So it was less felt. And then the other question is, most felt by which citizens? 50% of Americans pay 4% of the taxes. What? That means the upper 50 pay 96% of the taxes. So they're not feeling it at the lower level. In some cases, they get subsidized. So it's not just an issue of which of these three is most felt, and this matters for electoral reasons, right? I really feel it, kick the bums out. Or I don't feel it, that program sounds really great. It's apparently a freebie, yay! So this matters for electoral results. And then the issue of which citizens. I won't spend a lot of time on the distribution of this. I could spend a whole lecture on that, but those are some of the questions to ask. But here's principle number one. This will be a radical kind of contention. It's all taxes. What? It's all taxes. I have three different categories, but I'm saying the whole thing is taxes. Why? Borrowing is ultimately supported by future taxes. There's no way they could borrow this much unless they could say, in the future, I'm going to tax people. So it's deferred taxation. Borrowing is deferred taxation. Taxation is immediate taxation. So debt is deferred taxes, in a certain, if you understand the principle. Now, what about inflation? What about the inflation that comes from money creation? I already dealt with that in October, so it's a big claim. But suppose money creation causes the purchasing power of money to go down, which means the cost of living goes up. Sounds like a tax. In fact, someone said once, inflation is the cruelest tax of all. Did you ever hear that? Why is it cruel? Why do they say why is it the cruelest? Every day. That's kind of, it's not legislative. There's no vote. This is brilliant. There's no tax bill voted on where you can say, who voted for that? I'm going to kick him. It's cruel in the sense of who knows the hell who did that? And then, as someone mentioned, you see it in groceries, apparel, gasoline. What are people likely to do? Blame it on the grocer, the gasoline seller. They blame it on the people charging the prices, even though the people that are charging the prices are reflecting a symptom of the money's worth less. Of course, I'd ask for more pieces of this thing, but I didn't print them. Most people don't know that. But you see how my point is, it's all taxation in a way, but these two, you can have a situation where you're shifting toward these two, and then, but why? Because that's what's happening. Why though? Here's principle, we're still on fiscal illusion here. Now here's principle number two. As public spending, that's the thing to be financed. As public spending increases to levels beyond what people are willing to pay in taxes, the financing mix, if you thought of a pie chart of, shifts toward borrowing and money printing. This is the beginning of a theory of why is borrowing out of control? And maybe because people aren't going to pay the full tax burden of what they voted to spend on. But that sounds like a contradiction. That's principle number two. The more this goes up to finance bigger government spending, the more the government will shift to using these methods because there's fiscal illusion and it's hard to see who did what. And plus, I'm voluntarily buying these bonds. They're not taxing me. I bought the bonds. There's another principle. So principle number three, borrowing and money creation are less felt. They're less experienced, let alone as negative, by most people compared to taxation, certainly compared to taxation. Public debt, what is it? As simple as I can put it, it's what is owed by the government having been borrowed.
From the taxpayer?
No, they just borrow it from someone. They say, here are bonds, notes and bills, you know there's Ted. Please give us money and we'll give you the bond and the bill. We give you evidence, like raising stock. If the stock market, they want to raise equity shares, here's some shares, we're going to print them, give us some money, we're going to do something with it. It's what government is, this is unrelated to taxation directly. We're just talking about what is public debt. It is the bonds and notes and bills that the government evidences when it borrows, gives you those. It's a stock in time, by the way. It's a picture in time, like your credit card balance. If I asked you, what's your credit card balance? And you said $20,000, that's your national debt. And then if I ask, how did it get there? You'd say, I spent more than I took in over the last year and put it on my credit card. That's what the debt is. It's the cumulative result of a past series of deficits. Now you can have surpluses as well. That would reduce the debt, pay back some of your debt. But that's what it is. The debt is what's the government's owed because it's borrowed it, and it's the cumulative result of past budget deficits. We're going here because we need an explanation of where do these debts come from? They obviously came from chronic deficit spending. Where did that come from? And I'm trying to boil it down for you so you see where this all comes from. These are the forms: bills, notes, T-bills, T-notes, T-bond. What does T mean? Treasury. Treasury, bills, notes, and bonds. The bonds are longer term, the notes are mid-term, the bills are short term. Now, if I just showed you a graph and said, here's the public debt, what do you think? Problem or not?
A little bit.
What?
A little bit.
Why? This is just the gross nominal debt. By the way, I put federal and state and local. People forget about state and local. North Carolina does borrow. California borrows. Illinois borrows. It's not just Washington that borrows. So I put both of them in here. And it total, federal is 32 trillion. But look at that, state and local is 9 trillion. The total is 41 trillion. What's the annual GDP right now? 27 trillion. Anyway, my point here is, this is out of context. This is just a number. Like if I said, Chip's mortgage just quadrupled to 3.4 million. I think Chip's gonna go, not to pick on you, but I think Chip's gonna go bankrupt. And then you realize, no, his home is worth 7 million. He borrowed against an asset, or his income is, why did the banker lend him money? Because they looked at the underlying capacity to pay and the asset, and that's what a mortgage is. So you have to bring in context, don't you? Although this does look scary. It says 1945 to 2022. Okay, now I'm going to relate it to income, because I would relate your mortgage to income, right? So why can't I relate the US public debt to income? Only it's national income, or GDP, what's called GDP. So now we have a ratio. That sounds a little more plausible. Well, tell me what the ratio is between the debt and my income. Because if that gets out of hand, I might not be able to repay the debt. See why? I'm relating it to income. This has gone up. It was going down for a bit there. This is just since 1970. Where is it now? By the way, this is federal, state, and local, so it's the 41 trillion. It's 160% of GDP. It used to be 80% at the turn of the century. It got down as low as, I don't know, 55%, just before Reagan got in. By the way, notice this, it was starting to come down under Reagan. This is the Reagan and Clinton years, and it came down, down, down. Interesting. Now remember, the denominator is GDP. So the economy has to be growing. And if the debt's growing faster than the economy, this ratio is going to go up. And studies have been done, although there's disputes about this, that the threshold is something like 100%, meaning if it goes above 100%, a country is inclined, more likely to default in the coming decade. Not all countries, some of them are less developed countries, and I'll talk about that at the end, but this is better context, right, than just the number. You need the number related to something that refers to servicing the debt, if that makes sense. What does this spike due to? COVID, well, not COVID, COVID policy. Go home, don't work, we will print checks so you can pay your bills, and we'll borrow it. Great. Now, if you back into what I said, where does the debt come from? A series of annual deficits. I hope I don't lose you here. So I need a picture of annual deficits. This is not the debt itself. This is every year, tell me how much you spent and whether you overspent, dear government. Did you spend more than you had in tax revenues? And that's called the budget deficit. Here, I'm relating it to GDP, again, to give it context. What are these two spikes? What is that? What? Right. Then they came down again though. Meaning after the war, they went back to roughly balancing the budget. So it was a temporary thing, but that's why in my talk, this is the welfare and warfare state problem. Lots of money is borrowed during wars. The question is whether it hangs around afterwards and becomes part of the total stock. Now, what is the trend here? This is interesting because there's no world wars here, but the trend in the last 20 years has been upward. Again, it fluctuates. But the point is, it's upward, and that's troubling. Why isn't the government balancing its budget? And by the way, balance means if it comes down below this line, so that would be a surplus. There's a couple of surpluses in here, but not that many. Most years, they spend too much relative to the tax income. So the last surpluses were 4 years in a row, 99, 2000, 2001, and 2002. So now, so we started with debt. Where does that come from? Annual deficits. Where does that come from? So we need to look at spending and revenues. It must be that we're not taking in enough revenues. Is that the problem? One party will say, we need to tax people more. There is a deficit problem. The problem is we're not taxing people enough. Let's close the gap that way. Well, here's a picture. This is from CBO, only a couple days ago. They update these every once in a while. This is from 1973 to now. And again, it's percentage of GDP, so it's a contextual thing. And the green line is revenues. The green line is tax revenues. And as we saw previously, that people will only pay so much in taxes, regardless of the rate. I'm only paying 18, 19% of what you want. The problem here is the outlays are skyrocketing above the revenues. They go in bunches, but that's roughly what's happened. This widening gap is the difference. That's the budget deficit. That's what the government has to borrow every year because it's spending, those are outlays, more than it's taking in. So see this gap widening? Spending is now 25%. This is just federal, by the way, not state and local. Spending is now 24% of GDP. The revenues coming in are only 18. So the gap is 7 percentage points. It's huge. By the way, this is a forecast. So CBO also says this isn't going to change anytime soon. This gap is going to remain. Again, what's this spike? COVID spending. So the argument here would be the problem is not insufficient tax revenues. If you saw the deficit occurring because tax revenues were plummeting, then you'd say, okay, there's something wrong with the tax system. Maybe. But here you see it's the spending system. Now I'm not even going to go into the composition of spending because we'd be here all night. But I hope you see that what stands behind the outlays are social welfare spending, defense spending, all the things government spends on, many of which it's stuff it can't afford. But it's electorally remunerative. I'll skip by this because this just shows that there's a close relationship between the money supply and the budget deficits. Why? The government is spending more than it takes in. It's borrowing, but it's also turning to the Federal Reserve saying, could you print more money, please? Could you print more money and buy our bonds, please? That's a technical point, though, I'll leave for a moment. But notice this, a very close correlation between that debt to GDP ratio, which I already showed you. The debt is growing as a share of GDP. And look at the size of the bank, the balance sheet at the Fed. What does the balance sheet at the Fed consist of? Anyone who knows. What does the Fed own, mostly? It's not the building. They own government bonds. Interesting. So government bonds as a percent of the economy is skyrocketing, and guess what balance sheet is expanding? The Fed is buying many of these bonds. Why? Why can't the market buy these bonds? Why does the Fed have to buy these bonds?
They're the only buyer.
I have to skip by this very quickly too because I'm short on time. But just so you know, the bond yield, the interest rate on bonds, should relate to how much you borrow, right? If you go to the bank and say, I'm way over leveraged, I have a lot of debt, I'm not sure I can pay this debt back. First of all, you might not get the loan, but even if you got the loan, would the banker charge you a higher or lower rate? Higher rate because you're riskier. Okay, I'll charge you 13%. There's a close relationship between the inflation rate, the rate at which the government is debasing the money, and the bond yield. That's interesting. They go very close. There's a correlation there, 66% of positive correlation. When rates are very high, it's amidst a period of very high inflation. It's been lower, but they're both going up now. I'll leave that for Q&A. Here's a study I did for AIER. I just took the last 150 years. Instead of cherry picking the data, sometimes it's good to just say 50 years, then the next 50 years, then the next 50 years. But this was convenient because we had different monetary regimes. I haven't talked much about monetary regimes, but if the Fed can print money without limit, it's going to be able to help the government borrow a lot better than if it was handcuffed to the gold standard, right? And it couldn't print money without limit. Well, from 1921 to 1948, we're on a gold exchange standard. The Federal Reserve could not issue money without limit. It was on the Bretton Woods gold exchange standard. On the pre-Bretton Woods. And then from 48 to 71, it was on the Bretton Woods system, also a gold-based system. But since 1971, if you know, the dollar has not been on the gold standard. In fact, no country has had a gold standard currency. Well, I'm looking here at the growth rate of the economy. Usually it was argued you can't have a gold-based money because the economy will be restricted. It can't grow enough because there's not enough gold in the world. Remember that argument from Keynes and others. The US economy grew 4.9% per annum in this period. This is, 27 years. And then 4.2, but look how anemic the growth rate has been under the paper money standard or the fiat money standard. The growth rate has been anemic. And another stat I give you is what portion of the budget, what percent of the time was it in deficit? About 59% of the time when it was on the gold standard. But off the gold standard, it's been in deficit 94% of the time. Is that coincidental? It's easier to run budget deficits if you can print money without limit. If you have as a backstop the central bank with the treasury can call them up and say, please assist us in this deficit spending. If you can't do that, you're not going to deficit spend as much. Now here's the one where I took 50-year periods. This is going further back, 1868. So this is right after the Civil War. There is no Federal Reserve. There's no central bank. And it was the golden age, really. The growth rate of spending is minimal. The tax revenues are minimal. They're way down here. And the debt is minimal. But then as we move into this intermediate period, the government is growing, the revenues are growing, the spending is growing, but also the debt is growing. These are all as percentages of GDP. And now in this more recent period, you can see how big government is as a percent of GDP, but it's also borrowing more and more. That's the kind of puzzle people have. And it's back to my theme of what are they willing to finance this much bigger government spending with? The black bar, notice it's gone down, down, down. The black bar is the growth rate of the economy. We are losing economic vitality. We are losing economic growth over the past 150 years, and it's getting worse with each 50-year period. And accompanying that is massive higher share of GDP devoted to government spending and taxing. Last one, federal debt and economic growth. The black lines here are debt to GDP. Not much here, average 12%. Here, average 50%. Here, 58%, but we know we're up to like 120% now, right? More recently. With that, you get down, down, down growth numbers. There seems to be an inverse relationship, not seems to be, there is, between the growth rate of the economy and the borrowing of the government. Now you could flip this and say, wait a minute, Salsman, you got the causality wrong. The reason the government's borrowing more is the economy's weak. Of course, the economy's weak, they're not going to get as much tax revenues. So they're going to borrow more. So then you need a deeper discussion of why is the economy weakening with every passing half century. But what if part of the reason was the government is becoming a bigger part of the economy and it's diverting wealth, it's transferring wealth, it's redistributing wealth, not creating wealth. So if you really wanted to multiply wealth, you wouldn't divide it. Redistribution of wealth is a division, right? It's a diversion I take from Peter to pay Paul. I'm taking wealth that exists and giving it to somebody else. But if growth and prosperity is the multiplication of wealth, you do not multiply it by dividing it. That's just simple math. Again, down, 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 however you measure it, industrial production or real GDP. Here, I'm taking it just from 1960. I'm not going all the way back to the Civil War. Even if you cut the deck since 1960, which is only 60 years ago, each successive period, 20-year period, down, down, down. Here's a trend line. This is just the growth in GDP every year. Again, it fluctuates. There's recessions in here. But the trend line is down. It's definitely down. In the last 20 years, the average annual growth rate was 1.8. It used to be 3.8. This is per year now. If you grow anything, 3.8 a year over 20 years, a portfolio, your height, it's enormous. But if you only grow 1.8% a year, it's almost like you're stagnating. As we're doing, we're stagnating. What's interesting about this chart is I include the Biden administration's forecast of economic growth. There isn't even an optimistic forecast of economic growth. It's the expectation that it'll stay 1.8 a year. Wow. So they're not even trying, in a sense. They're saying, we're going to have a slow growth economy. That's what their average is, 1.8 over the next 7 years it was at the time, 2024 to 31. All right. Make sure I finish on time. Got about 15 minutes. How do you default on debt? I don't mean personally or corporate-wise, we know that. Explicitly and implicitly. The most interesting thing about public debt is the implicit part. But explicitly is you just stop paying principal and interest. That's pretty obvious. I'm not paying the principal and interest anymore. That's an obvious default. And countries have done that. Many countries have done that. Greece, more recently, most famously, right? The Greece debt defaults of 2011, 2010, 2011. Failure to pay principal and interest when due. Now, this other one is becoming more and more important, or selectively repay. What does that mean? I'm not going to pay everyone, just some people that I prefer. Like, maybe we shouldn't pay China now, but we should pay the Social Security recipients, the debt that's owed. Right? So if you have a bunch of creditors, but you say to yourself, some of them are going to get paid, some of them are not. You start discriminating between who you repay. That is a disaster for the reputation of the debtor. But that's being discussed increasingly in Washington, just so you know. Now, what is implicit? Implicit means almost furtive, surreptitiously. Did you just default to me? Or did you just take something? Is this a pickpocket? Did something just happen? Inflation is one of those. Inflation. We'll pay you back in money that's not worth as much. We paid you. We paid you the principal and interest. So we didn't explicitly default, but the money's worth less. That's a kind of default. Inflation is a default. Inflation is a default, especially if the government is the monopoly issuer of money. It's the sole cause of debasing the money. And it's highly motivated to do so because it's a huge borrower. This is a conflict of interest for you. They're a huge borrower and they run the money presses. And no one's going to figure out that the higher prices at the grocer are not the grocer's fault, but the Fed's fault. It's brilliant. I'll pay back the debt in cheaper dollars and you'll blame the grocer. Brilliant. See how it works? Financial repression is another one. Japan's been doing this for years. You make people buy your debt. Insurance companies, banks, mutual funds, pension funds, you must buy Japanese debt. You must buy, you whip up a artificial demand for the debt. See how it works? We're issuing cascades of new debt. Oh no, someone might not buy it. Make them buy it. The interest rate, all else equal, will be lower. So that's called financial repression, making people buy your debt because they wouldn't voluntarily do so. And at a low interest rate, which you normally wouldn't pay a low interest rate, you pay a high interest rate. That's just done by regulation. That's just done by diktat, fiat. Now, I wanted to include this because I don't want to come out as totally against government ever borrowing. That seems silly. Like, what if you're at war You could tax people to the max during war, but it's going to possibly weaken your efforts at war, not to mention hurt morale. So, I mean, at some point, is it okay to borrow as long as you pay it back within a reasonable period afterwards? Personally, what would we say? I think I'll borrow to buy groceries, or I'll borrow to buy a house or a car, a tangible asset that will help me, that will be durable in some way, right? The second one makes more sense. You don't want to be borrowing for consumption purposes, because where's the source of the money to repay? But if you buy a car, a house, some kind of productive asset, then you have the basis for repaying it. This is the golden rule of public finance, not my phrase, it's in the literature, it's fascinating. There's something called the golden rule of public finance. Guess what it is? It's okay for government to borrow if they borrow for productive purposes. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, we could debate whether these are, especially when government does them, whether they're truly productive or not. But it's a lot different than saying, I'm gonna borrow so I can take from Peter and give it to Paul. That's different because there's no wealth creation. There's no underlying tangible source of wealth creation. So this is a thing, but it's totally been eroded over the past century or so. It used to be the sine qua non of being a good public finance, a treasury secretary, a financier, an exchequer. If you stood up in the Commons, Parliament, anywhere else and said, let's borrow, to consume, you'd be laughed out of the chamber. But that's done all the time now, because most of government spending is transfer from one pocket to another. It is not infrastructure. They do not, I've done the numbers, there's a decreasing share of money spent on actual things that would help the productive prowess of the economy. And interestingly, in this work, I found a correspondence, now get this, because gold is in each of the names. I found a correspondence between this principle and the gold standard. In other words, they followed this principle when they also had money convertible into gold. And I go a little deeper and say, guess what the ethical code is? The golden rule. Treat people as you would have them treat you. Don't be a parasite. Don't be a freeloader, right? Treat people value for value in exchange. So the golden rule in the sense of an ethical principle, which is centuries old, we know that, right? Millennial old. The golden rule goes way back, how to treat people, how to consider other people. You would think that has nothing to do with borrowing. You would think it has nothing to do with central banking or money creation. It does. That ethic of, I'm gonna treat people fairly. I'm gonna issue fair and objective, dependable money convertible into gold, not my arbitrary whim by Jay Powell. And I'm gonna conduct government borrowing in such a way that it's borrowing for real stuff, not for transfers or redistribution. They all go together. And they all have gold in the name, which is easy to remember. Well, I already mentioned this. The welfare state is the transfer state. That's the idea of we are redistributing wealth because we consider certain people disadvantaged or unable, and we're going to tax the able. But the warfare state is no small thing either. You could argue that if it's a, quote, productive war, it's worth borrowing for. Well, what would a productive war be? We have a true enemy, and they're an existential threat to us. And we need to borrow money and build tanks and build munitions and build whatever to get rid of this enemy. You could argue that that's a decent investment. You could argue that the Reagan deficit spending of the 80s to get rid of the Soviet Union, not a bad investment, if that's what happened. SDI, the military buildup, to the point where the Soviets said, Uncle, we can't possibly do what you're doing. But he was criticized for borrowing so much in that period. But if you can get rid of the Cold War, that kind of stuff, so you can't be, I don't think, totally anti-war, but you could certainly be against 20 years in Afghanistan, spending $3 trillion, borrowing $3 trillion, and at the end the Taliban wins. Okay, that sounds wasteful. That sounds very damaging and wasteful. We still have the debt though. We still have the debt left over from the Iraq-Afghanistan war. Almost done. Many years ago, a French foreign minister said, the US has an exorbitant privilege by having the dollar. Why? What's the privilege? It can issue all these dollars and everyone will want them. Everyone will demand them. Why? Because they're credible, they're reliable. It was a period when the US was on the gold standard. That's why it was reliable. This was before we went off the gold standard. And that idea of exorbitant privilege, again, is the idea of if you're a formidable enough country with the economic prowess and fiscal rectitude, the currency you're issuing is so reliable and so dependable, everyone else in the world wants to use it. They'll have their own currencies, but they'll want to use it. And the central banks of other countries will want to hold it in their reserves because it's almost as good as gold. That's what's called a reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency that other central bankers hold because they think it's so reliable as backing for their own currency. And before World War I, which country in the world had the best currency? Yeah, yes, you know your history. Great Britain, the pound, was more credible than the dollar. The British Empire, Britain was on the gold standard since 1717. For 200 years, they were, almost without exception, they were on the gold standard. And they went off it in World War I. But as a result, every other central bank in the world trusted the British pound, held it. It was as good as gold, as good as sterling. Same thing, silver and gold. And then the US displaced Britain. Britain adopted Keynesian policies, massively deficit spent in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. They had the British disease, if you remember that, where people were fleeing Britain because Britain was socializing everything and ruining the pound. And the dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. The key, imagine, is borrow in your own currency. You can borrow a lot, right? But what if you're issuing the currency you borrow in? You can always print more of the money to pay back. But if you're Greece and you borrow a lot, what's the problem? Why did Greece have a real problem, other than they borrowed too much? They weren't issuing drachma anymore. That was the old Greek currency. They were in the euro system. They couldn't unilaterally print euro to pay their debt back, so they were stuck. So it's a very weird thing. If you denominate your borrowing in your own currency, and then you can issue your currency without limit, voila, you can borrow and print money seemingly without limit. And the US is in that position. The US does not issue debt convertible into yen, because it can't call up the Bank of Japan and say, please print more yen. And most other countries can't. If there was once a depounding, can there also be a de-dollarization? I don't know what depounding is. It sounds vaguely sexual, I don't know. But getting rid of the pound no longer being a reserve currency. Could that happen with the dollar? Imagine if it did, what does it mean? There's a cascade of dollars being supplied, but now it's being heavily demanded because it's a reserve. What if people don't demand it anymore? Economics 101 says supply coming in, demand going away, the value of the thing's going to go down. That means the purchasing power of the dollar would really plummet if there was de-dollarization. There's various ways to measure this, but it is a thing. You can measure, the central banks of the world do issue data on what are their reserves denominated in. About 60% of them now are denominated in dollars. But that's down from 80% 30 years ago. So the US would have a much higher inflation rate, assuming it kept producing dollars, if there was a de-dollarization in the world and people didn't want to hold dollars as much. And you see China today and Russia today, and to some extent India today, joining together and Saudi Arabia, and saying, we're not going to use the dollar anymore. We're not going to use the dollar anymore. We're going to use the yuan or some other currency. That is if it keeps up, that is a dangerous precedent for the US inflation rate. All right, I'll finish on this, because the last point is, I said the deficit of democracy. Fiscal profligacy reflects unrestrained democracy. Fiscal profligacy, meaning spending like drunken sailors, is a product of unrestrained democracy. And what do I mean by that? Unlimited majority rule, where people can just vote for anything without consequence. And democracy is, and mostly unrestrained democracy, is kind of considered the ideal political system. No one's going to defend autocracy. That's rule by one. I'm not. Demos means people. Rule by the people. But what if the people are freeloaders? or a sufficient number of them that they put us in this spending and borrowing spin downward. How about put it this way, budget gaps, difference between spending and revenues. Budget gaps reflect institutionalized, fiscalized gaps between makers and takers. The more you can classify the country as, there's a bunch of makers over there, people creating businesses, creating wealth, generating income, but then there's other people who aren't even working, but they're takers. They're getting receipts from the government for not working. The more that gap occurs, the more you're going to get budget gaps. So that's the deepest I can go for you. Like if you're trying to convert debt, fiscal deficits, the kind of things that make people's eyes glaze over into an ethic, which is really hard to do, into a moral code, that's the closest I can come to doing it. There's something about the desire to freeload which leads to national insolvency. But challenge me on that if it doesn't make sense in the Q&A. Conclusion, unless and until democracy is more constitutionally constrained, we can talk about what that means, fiscal profligacy will persist. It's gonna keep going. It's not gonna stop just because a couple of congressmen are elected and they want fiscal responsibility. There's bigger forces coming at them that's gonna make them bend and fold. Now, ensuring is a bit too strong. Ensuring national stagnation, decay, and ruin, I would say that's the closest thing you can come to a forecast, because there's a whole history of this. It's not like there isn't a history of governments doing this. And it isn't like a big blow up crash one day. Sometimes it's just a long, drawn out, boring stagnation, like in Japan. I mean, Japan has had what they call the lost decades. There's 3 of them now. The 90s, 2000s, lost in the sense of what? There's no real huge blow up. There's no collapse. They haven't been taken over by China, but they've stagnated for 3 decades. There's no growth. The population is aging enormously. There's nothing going on there. Unlike, remember the 70s and 80s when they were car companies and technology and Japan was flourishing? They resorted to excessive spending and budget deficits and fiscal stimulus programs and Keynesian politics to the point where they've run themselves into the ground. And the US could do that. The US could easily do that. So I'll stop there and take questions, and thank you for attention to a kind of difficult topic. Thank you. And again, if you want a copy of my book afterwards, I'll be over there and glad to sign them. And George, yes?
Productivity. Can you make notes of where we are now, where we're going?
Well, the productivity numbers, I can show you, just like the other numbers that I showed down, the productivity numbers have gone down. Now, productivity is different from production because it's output per hour. So it's a rate of growth, or per person. And you want that going up because that's a source of rising living standards. We want to be able to produce more in the same amount of time or the same amount in less time and then go to the beach. Now, leisure time is good, leisure time is nice. So if the work week is shrinking, that's a good thing, but you can't get that unless there's productivity gains. Where do the productivity gains come from? Capital. Humans working with technology. Fancy word for capital, tools, equipment. And where's the capital come from? Savings and investment. If the government is borrowing most of the money out of the pool, there's not going to be enough savings to fund productive enterprise. So there's a sequencing even there. The standard of living is going to fall because there's not enough productivity. There's not enough productivity because there's not enough capital accumulation. There's not enough capital accumulation because the government is either taxing businesses to death or they themselves are sucking out most of the savings and not leaving enough for others. Does that make sense, George?
Thank you.
Chris?
I was going to say, in
Yeah.
one of your charts, it showed different decades. It started, one was 1890 to 1917, and then it went into 1919, I think, and I just didn't understand why you split it up that way. Is that it? Yeah, the 50-year period, that one. Before, after this one.
When I did the study,
Oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
1917.
when I did the study, this was in 2019,
Yeah.
I had 2018 numbers, and I went back as far as I could until the numbers ran out. And it was about 150 years. And prior to that, prior to the Civil War, it's hard to get good numbers. So I looked at it and I said, there's 150 years. I could cherry pick it and say, this period was great because it supports my thesis. And instead I just said, no, just take 50-year chunks.
Oh, I see, okay.
That's all.
Yeah.
So no one can accuse me of cherry picking. I just say, okay, what happened in the first 50 years? Then the next 50 years, then the last 50 years. Now, once you see the numbers are very different, you can start asking, what was going on?
I was just
During-
ready to hit on Woodrow Wilson in that period there.
Ah, right. Yeah. Yeah, well, there's a lot going on in each category, but I hope you see the reason why I use the method, because economists are often accused of cherry picking. Yeah, Bob?
Building on both comments, actually, in terms of productivity and the actual activity that was going on in these given periods, we were making a lot more things earlier in those time periods, and then we have diminished the amount of things we actually need to produce, and we've moved into service segments, software.
Yeah.
technology, so
Finance, yeah.
Has that been part of the culprit here, is that we are not expanding the amount of people who earn money doing something productive?
That's a good question. You get that question. You have a manufacturing sector, you have an agricultural sector, you have a service sector, and say then finance. Those are distinctly different sectors, right? And if you went to Hong Kong, what's the biggest sector? Finance, right? Very little farm. It's like 90% finance. So on some level, you could say, there's something wrong with Hong Kong. Well, it's not diversified, it's all finance. Not really. If they're good at it, they should only do finance. The international trade, free trade, globalization argument is specialize in what you specialize in and then trade. And that makes sense. And if Russia is a heavily resource extractive industry country, then good. Then they'll sell their stuff to a service sector. So I think there's something to what you're saying, Bob. Namely, has the US manufacturing base been cored out? We got a Rust Belt and all that. Yes, I would say largely due to forcing labor unions on car companies and steel companies and textile companies. That was part of it, just forcing companies to strike bargains that were unprofitable. And that was done what? To help the worker. It was mostly the Democrats doing that. But also environmental regulations, but that was Nixon. The EPA started in 1970. So labor union legislation, and I would say the EPA, have been two things: are anti-industrial, anti-manufacturing, anti-extraction. You can't open up a mine or pump oil. You can't even build pipelines anywhere. Anything of the kind you're talking about, very difficult in America. Not because we aren't good at it, but because it's illegal or not remunerative because of the tax structure. Now, notice when those things go offshore, go to other countries, we complain that they, quote, stole our jobs. But actually, we repelled our jobs. We adopted policies suicidally and said, we're not gonna do that stuff anymore. But to the extent the US is good at finance, Wall Street, advertising, media, that isn't some of it might be artificial, but it is true. There's nothing wrong with the US, doing more finance over time, or more service sector over time, if it's a natural outcome of talents. So I have a mixed answer there. Policy has partly cored out the manufacturing sector, but you don't want to go to the root of saying the government needs to adopt a policy and have kind of what Trump did, and have manufacture be a set part of the economy. You don't want industrial planning, but you don't want the government getting in the way of these sectors either. Let them just figure out what their share of the overall economy should be. Yeah, Ted?
So it's pretty horrible. I'm remembering the reference, but there's a proverb that says this, the borrower will always become slave to the lender, right?
Yeah.
So, one could argue that we're kind of bowing to China right now. And one of the as I study a lot of the things that you're studying, one of the things I don't know, and I don't know where to look, honestly, is what percentage of our debt does China have?
Yeah.
Right? And what would happen to our economy if China's, because, right now, Treasury Secretary Yellen is kind of rattling the cage of China and saying, don't you dare help Russia, because there's going to be severe economic consequences if you help Russia avoid our sanctions. But what if couldn't China just go out and say, screw it, we're going to sell and get rid of all this debt? What does that do to our country? And is that part of the reason why Biden is maybe bowing to China?
They could do that. I don't think it would have much of an effect. So the markets, you can tell, are just huge. I mean, the U.S. debt alone is 31 trillion. The other state debt brings it up to 42 trillion. China holds about 7%. About 7. So the Treasury does, it's hard to estimate these sometimes, but you can measure who holds our stuff, who holds the bonds and the treasuries. And of course, banks hold them, insurance companies hold them, mutual funds hold them, but foreign governments will hold them. That's how they hold the reserves. Remember I said the dollar is a reserve currency? So when the Bank of China owns dollars, they own them because they're sitting there holding treasury bonds of the US. Now, they're holding those presumably out of self-interest. They think the bonds are worth it. They think it's a good yield. If they didn't, they'd buy German bonds, you know. So I kind of attribute those kind of arguments to why would they do it if it hurt them? Because if China came out tomorrow and said, we are dumping government bonds, you could say that bond prices would fall. It's like if they came out and said, we own Tesla and we're going to dump all the shares, the Tesla shares would fall. But they just don't own a big enough share of it to have that happen. And I'm not sure out of self-interest alone they would be willing to do it because they don't want to hurt their own holdings, if that makes sense. The flip side of the proverb, by the way, would be, if you borrow a little from the bank controls you. But if you borrow a lot from the bank, you control the bank. Because the banker's like, because I've been in banking, there's nothing more petrifying than to hear that your borrower is going to default because your career is over. Well, that used to be that way. In the early 80s, your career was over if you had this bad record of you lent to a borrower that didn't repay you. So you can borrow so much that, and you're actually saying that about China, couldn't it be the case that the lender has control over you? So you had it like both ways, actually. Yes, way in the back.
Could you recommend any books, podcasts, articles that might break down the kind of welfare spending, non-defense, discretionary spending, just to try to make sense of like, you know, I love that line that democracy falls when people realize they can give themselves money out of the public treasury. Like, what are we voting for if they're not getting anything?
Yeah, that's a quote. It's attributed to various people, from Franklin to somebody else a long time ago. Yeah, a country falls when people realize they can vote away the wealth of other people. That's a good one. I should have had that up here. I can't name a particular podcast that does that, but the CBO, for example, the report I just cited about revenues and spending as a percent of GDP, I was going to put it in the slide, but right below that, it had a chart on, well, what is the composition of the spending? Is it on defense? Is it on, and once you start bringing it down, you say, oh, it's the welfare state. It's basically the programs we talk about, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, these things are exploding. And they're actuarially unsound, and they're basically fraudulent. And the government is just borrowing money to fund them, and so that's blowing the budget out as well. And those are called, by the way, unfunded liabilities, which aren't even in the 41 trillion. I don't know if you know that there are estimates of, well, what if the government actually had to borrow to close those gaps like overnight? The answer is 200 trillion. So it's almost like call it the liability issue for the government is like a iceberg. The tip above it is like the money supply. The money supply is like 5 trillion. Right below that is the national debt, 41 trillion. It's getting bigger and bigger, like a pyramid, right? And the very bottom, the biggest chunk is the unfunded. You know, again, actuaries estimating how much does the government owe people by saying they're going to be on Social Security. That's something like 200 trillion. And that either has to be borrowed or taxed in the future. So it's like a leading indicator of what the future fiscal burden will be. And why are those easy to accumulate? Because you're just running for office and you're saying, dear elderly, I'm going to increase your benefits. Yay! And you get voted for it. And there's no one taxing you for it. There's no increase in the payroll tax, right? But it's a commitment. And they might default on it. They might wake up one day and say, we're not paying granny. But when Obama was asked that, when there was a budget squeeze and a debt ceiling debate under Obama, he came to the podium and literally said, now, in a fix, am I going to not pay granny or China? That's what he said. And then he laughed. Because the answer, of course, is, I'm not paying China. A president said that. In a fix, in a pinch, if we only have so much money, I'm going to pay the granny on Social Security, but not China. The US bond market would have collapsed if that were true, if the Treasury selectively paid who it wanted, you know, based on, I don't know, cronyist principles. Rod?
Yeah, since it appears there's no political will to deal with this, what would a balanced budget amendment do for this?
Well, they've tried balanced budget amendments, and the first thing to note is it wouldn't guarantee a surplus. So you might get rid of deficits, but you don't have any of the opposite, which is surpluses, which you would need to get the debt down over the number of years. That's point one. But point two is they never have any restrictions on taxing. So imagine a budget balance was passed, a budget balance amendment, where the federal government had to balance the budget, and there's a deficit. And they're not going to cut spending. Why? Because it's electorally damaging. Now they might say, we're going to raise taxes, but how do they avoid the electoral fallout from that? What? They could go to inflation, but no, it would be tax the rich. That's why Biden runs around saying the rich aren't paying their fair share. I found 3 corporations last year that paid nothing. Why is he doing that? Because they're a minority. The voter hears that, and the voter doesn't hear like the tax man's coming after me. The politicians are telling, no, we're going after the rich, the fat cats, and then most people have no idea that if you confiscated all the wealth of the top, 100 wealthiest people in this country, it would fund the government for 13 days. Days. That's how much the government spends. But most people don't know that. So they hear it as, that's the problem you'd get though. You'd get forcible tax hikes under the pretense of, we're being fiscally responsible. They told us we had to balance the budget. They didn't tell us how. Now, if the balanced budget amendment said at any point in time when there's a deficit, half of it has to come down due to spending cuts, and half of it has to come down due to tax increases, maybe, but how would that be done? That was actually Ross Perot's idea. If you're old enough to remember Ross Perot, in 1992, that's what his plan was. He had no plan other than just split the difference.
And the social security.
A fundamental solution would be you have to get rid of these programs. But you have to do it, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But you have to do it safely in the sense of you have to dismantle it. It's almost like, they are like ticking time bombs. So imagine a bomb squad in a city. There's a bomb on Main Street, right? The specialists go in, snipping things, so you get out of it clean, right? You can do that with all these programs. I've studied them. You can do it with the Federal Reserve. I have a plan to dismantle the Federal Reserve in 1 year. Here's the key, safely. Because you can't dismantle these things and have the currency go nuts. You can't dismantle Social Security and have people out on the street because they didn't expect, they expected a check to come. You can phase these things out safely, but the government won't do it. It's not a technical issue. It's not like, we can't figure out the accounting. We don't quite know how to do. That's not true, actually. There's like umpteenth plans by libertarians and others for how to dismantle these things, including not having forever wars, which are very expensive. There's a big battle over that. How many wars should the U.S. be involved in? How many bases should it have all over the country, all over the world? Because they're very costly, right? Well, if you have the neocons arguing we should be policemen of the world and we should be involved in every possible war, that's costly. It's definitely costly. They may think it's helpful, but fiscally, there's no doubt about it. It can bankrupt you. That was a riff there. Others?
We gotta wrap it up.
Okay. How many? One more?
So we had talked, or you had talked earlier about U.S. treasuries and bonds and how they are becoming increasingly worthless. And then you talked about
Not completely, not worthless, but
well,
they can lose value if they're overissued.
less
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah.
Then you talked about Japan and how they were forcing people
Yes.
to buy the treasuries and bonds. So this is off topic, but Bitcoin, do you feel like perhaps some people are investing in Bitcoin instead of gold, and that's why the price of gold hasn't gone up, to get out of this whole treasure? Maybe they learned from Japan, maybe they see the writing on the wall.
Well, I would say some of Bitcoin's attraction is that it's a convenient and low-cost method of transacting all over the world. But the second one is it definitely has this component of there are libertarians who like it because they think they're using non-government money, which they are in a sense, right? And I think the same thing is true of gold. Gold, forgetting whether you like central banking or not, gold can be a decent investment and it can outperform financial assets for long stretches of time. So it's significant that Wall Street almost never advocates owning gold. They only advocate stocks and bonds, even if you lose your shirt owning stocks and bonds. And you do lose your shirt when there's inflation under financial assets. You gain, on the other hand, real tangible assets rise in value, as you know. So real estate, gold, Bitcoin, because it's limited in its issuance. Bitcoin has an algorithm where it's not issued without limit. It's not like a Federal Reserve token. The Bitcoin is only issued in glacially slow incremental bits.
Correct.
And that is one of the reasons it preserves its value, but that's also true of gold. The percentage of gold in the world that comes out of the mines every year on top of the stock that's accumulated is like 0.5%. It's just like Bitcoin. They both grow very slowly, and people will want to hold that thing because it can't be like alchemy issued out of nothing. So there's a lot more to say about Bitcoin and gold than that, but I'll stop there. Thank you, Brad.
Well, I thought it was brilliant because it encapsulates so much in a relatively short period of time. I know I'm going to take some stuff from some people for this going too long, but I am really, really just happy that we have you
Thank you.
on our staff, so to speak. You're brilliant and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we are facing our own sort of deficit where if we keep on the current trajectory without other infusion of membership and cash, we will not be able any longer to put on the Basquiat Society, which I think would be a real shame. So if you are inclined to want to help put together a kind of fundraiser and you have experience in that area, we would love to do an event and invite a lot more people. The last 2 years, if coming up on September, will be our sort of experiment with the Basquiat Society of Raleigh, which we always thought would be fantastic and a great resource, and like I said last time, a refuge for people who are concerned about stuff like the debt. So please let me know if you have that kind of experience. We are really looking forward to our next couple of speakers. Next month we will have Justice Phil Berger Jr. That makes him, I was joking about this, Richard, because last time I said we were going to have Justice Newby, which was wrong. And then I said, well, we might as well just say we were having Oliver Wendell Holmes and see if anybody would corrected me. But yeah, so we're having the Junior Burger, which reminded me of A&W root beer when I was a kid, remember? Yeah. Anyway, and then we were going to have Amy Cook, but we're going to get an equally great person from John Locke. Amy can't do it. We're going to have Donna King, who's the editor of the Carolina Journal, which is fantastic. I'm elated about that. And in September, I think we're going to talk more about school choice with somebody who we're trying to line up. And in October's open, but November, I wanted to push this book and the author, Just the Truth, by Jen LaGreca. It's a fantastic book. It really is. I'm about halfway through it. It's basically, this is incredible. It's about a journalist who confronts the President of the United States about corruption in a federal election scheme. And this was written in 2019, so pretty prescient. And we're just gonna see the movie version of this. So that'll be in November. It'll be kind of cold. We can turn on the fire. That fire is a roasting fire, by the way. But and we'll watch that movie. It will be a little bit longer session. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you in May.
And Brad, just remind them, I'll be giving away books for those who
Professor Salsman said he's going to be giving away books, and also, I should have mentioned also, you can get Just the Truth at the book stand, at the entry there. It's been signed by the author. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Brad. Now I got to deal with